Hello, everybody. I think it's possible that this video is going to be a little bit garbled and difficult to articulate, but I kind of wanted to explore this thing that's been kind of on my mind for a while. I have noticed, just generally online, in a way that's based pretty much just in curiosity, that the use of the word creepy or other such similar words to describe a deck quite frequently gets used in ways that are different from how I would use that word. Someone will be going through a deck or, showing a deck or discussing a deck or something like that, discussing the tarot even generally, and they may make reference to a deck. At any rate, they'll kind of be referring to or showing a particular aesthetic or set of concepts in a deck that they then call kind of creepy, but the way it's said is in this really intensely negative way according to their taste. I have no judgment of this whatsoever, but I also have to admit that I don't totally or always understand what's negative about that word in that context, but then also what's negative about the aesthetic of the deck. Now, in thinking about this, I was like, well, how would I dissect my understanding of those aesthetics or those concepts or those artists that produce decks or whatever the case? And, I think people often are responding to what could be considered an unsettling aspect of a deck or a set of imagery. They could be responding to, it might be in terms of personal preference for like color choices, lighter or darker, certain types of color tones. They could be responding to something more specific about the ideology in a deck and so on. And of course, everyone has their own personal experience. So at any rate, in kind of mulling these things over, I thought, you know what? I would really like to make a video linking tarot to or talking about tarot in a way that shows why I think the sort of darker, creepy decks are the most cozy and familiar and delightful for me. Again, everyone's going to have completely different reasons why they do or don't feel similarly and so on. So I thought I would try to keep it specific and make an attempt anyway, and just sort of creatively explore some of the reasons I really like darker, creepy decks. So first and foremost, I will sort of start with a bit of backstory or background information, and then kind of relate it to some decks, and then possibly go into a bit of creative exploration from there. One of my favorite artists of all time is Hieronymus Bosch. Loosely speaking, end of Middle Ages, early Renaissance, Northern Renaissance kind of aesthetic. In general, you get in that sort of overall school of painting or style, very, very angular looking figures, a lot of darker, more somber colors, a very, very distinctive Northern European clothing style at the time, a lot of structure and a lot of religious symbolism, but like in the sense that it's highly layered, as much of the art at the time would have been anyway. And I find that a lot of that registers to me as really familiar. Hieronymus Bosch in particular, his hellscapes are some of my favorite images of all time. I think, and I'll probably try to put on screen some examples. If one were to look at the details in those pictures, you can find so many scenarios that depict the realities of lived experience, which is part of the point of the hellscape, is to kind of show the breadth of the society that can end up there. But also, I just think a lot of the characters in his, for example, the most famous Garden of Earthly Delights triptych, the Hell panel, loads of those little figures just look like they could be your friends. They don't look menacing to me. They look really fun. They look interesting, they look funny, they look quirky, they look like they might share aspects of my sense of humor. They are often amalgamations of animals that I find really fascinating, and so on. Some of them look like they're having a very good time. So I was thinking though, like, why is that? Why do I find them so familiar? Why do I find them so much fun? And in my case, I think that goes back fairly early. One of the books I was given as a child was highly influential on me. It is this book here called Pish Posh, said Hieronymus Bosch. It was given to my family when I was probably about 7 or 8 years old by my aunt, who is a medieval professor. And, growing up around her and various other family members was very much steeped in history and things like that, historical music, historical aesthetics. This same aunt would have taken me as a teenager on a personal tour of the cloisters in New York, which was just an absolute blast. So a lot of this is quite formative anyway. I find a lot of the Northern Renaissance aesthetic also mimics, or it is very similar in nature to some of the portraiture you get in the sort of 19th century folk arts movement in the United States. So again, there's and I would have grown up around that aesthetic quite a lot as well. So some of it's just exposure and familiarity. But this book introduces you to the sort of nonsensical or seemingly nonsensical aspects of Bosch's work in a way that is distinctly non-threatening, but also very odd and strange and so on. So loosely speaking, it features a woman who is effectively, I suppose, Hieronymus Bosch's housekeeper. And the issue is that the little creatures in in Bosch's paintings keep coming to life, and she finds that quite inconvenient for the purpose of keeping house. So I will put the images on screen rather than holding up the book as I read it, but I'm going to read 1 or 2 pages. So here we have, I'm quitting your service. I've had quite enough of your 3-legged thistles asleep in my wash, of scrubbing the millstone you use for a dish, and riding to shops on a pickle-winged fish. Pish Posh, said Hieronymus Bosch. I mean, come on, if you're 7 or 8 years old, this is ridiculously cool. I don't mind the ferret. I do like the bee. All witches' familiars are friendly to me. I'd share my last crust with a pigeon-toed rat, and some of my closest relations are cats. My aunt was a squash, said Hieronymus Bosch. And then later in the story, take us under your wing, take us up on your back, they howled while the claws murmured clickety-clack. They're not what I wished for. When women are young, they want curly-haired daughters and raven-haired sons. In this vale of tears, we must take what we're sent, feathery, leathery, lovely, or bent. Now, implications of needing to have children aside, as a happily child-free individual, that's neither here nor there for me. The aesthetic of this book in particular really struck me, so that as I grew older, being interested in art, being interested in history, and being repeatedly exposed to the sort of nightmarish aspects of the art of the Northern Renaissance, of the Middle Ages, of manuscript illuminations, and so on, there was just never a point at which these figures weren't something I enjoyed. It was just really, really clear to me that this was something that made sense to my brain. Again, as a sort of a dark little kid myself with not the most positive use of my imagination at times, it was just really good to have a conduit for those darker aspects. And I would argue that's part of the point of a lot of the decks that explore those aesthetics. So, for example, I could have actually shown a good number of my decks because obviously I choose my decks for purchase, so I'm going to pursue the aesthetics I like anyway. But I've picked 2. I've picked the Deviant Moon Paradoxical, and I have picked the Magicae Daemonibus Tarot. Both indie and one of them limited edition, I'm afraid. But I wanted to show these decks because I think a lot of people obviously are aware of the Deviant Moon, for example, and I would be curious to know how many people find that the Deviant Moon, whether paradoxical or the normal sort of colorway. I would be curious to find how many people have seen the sort of Bosch-like elements or Northern Renaissance elements or late medieval elements in Patrick Valenza's work. As I mentioned in one of my other videos, I've seen a few instances now online of people talking about these figures in his decks, in his work, that don't seem menacing, but they are very dark and kind of macabre and melancholy. You know, but you feel their distress. They're often making these distressed little faces, or they're highly relatable. They're very expressive. So there's more than just the quote unquote grotesque happening here. So here I've just picked about 4 cards to kind of explore this idea in this deck. The first card I'm going to show is the 4 of Wands. We have a very, you know, quite intimate set of characters facing each other. There is, on some level or other, an interchange happening there, which suits the meaning of the 4 of Wands in some aspects. We have this sort of alchemical-looking, pipette-like fruit seed poddling house on stilts in also just generally very sort of nighttime, almost backlit aesthetic or lighting that I think is very much referencing the work of Bosch and other similar hellscapes, or even, you know, obviously more worldly aspects of his triptychs and things like that. Similarly here with the 6 of Wands, we have crowds reaching up to this figure that is, again, in a kind of seated, poddling kind of thing. Symbolism, loaded symbolism in their clothing, moon-like face, and little insect wings, sort of hybridized figure here. And then we also get into the aspects of the Deviant Moon that have historical clothing references, specifically, that I think are quite medieval, which is in keeping with a lot of tarot imagery and RWS imagery. But here we have a figure in a tunic with a hooded cloak and a long pointed end on the hood, which is a very distinctly European medieval feature. I'm noticing I'm showing a lot of wands. Perhaps that's the point with these images, which is actually interesting if you think about the hellscape images and sort of blasting fire furnaces in the background as well. And then here we have the 8 of Wands. I love the little bird carrying the book. Bird messengers carrying actual text is a medieval phenomenon. But here, especially in this coloration, the sort of red color, the red almost madder color of the woman's kirtle, presumably, but also this very distinct medieval hat with the veil beneath it, or medieval hood with the veil beneath it. Beautiful. If I move on now to the Magikai Demonibus, I think the references we get in Pish Posh said Hieronymus Bosch to various characters made of composite parts, the pickle-winged fish, clock faces with lobster claws, and little dancing thistles and things like that. I think the imagery in this deck in particular shows the sort of historical elements at play there, because this deck is made historical marginalia from manuscripts and so on. So we have here 4 of Swords. Again, I think that's a very friendly sort of smile. You could decide that it's a bit leery or creepy or macabre or melancholy, or at the very least confusing, or maybe stymieing if you were to encounter such a figure. But I think it depends on how one feels called to use their imagination in that regard, what directions one is pulled in creatively, and of course, one's tastes and so on. 3 of Cups. I think this deck in particular asks you to do a lot of intuitive responding to the images. It's not always clear what the idea behind each image choice was. And while I think in some decks that could be a drawback, possibly depending on a person's taste, in this case, I think it's quite welcome. I really enjoy it. It's definitely a great sort of brainstorming or creative exercise. Here we have the Four of Wands. And then 2 Major Arcana cards. I picked these because they're effectively kind of some of the most PG Major Arcana cards in the deck. And I really didn't feel quite like having to make lots of disclaimers quite so much this time. So here we have the Emperor, who honestly just looks really cute, but also with like an element of the Hellmouth, fantastical creatures. You know, the medieval imagination at play, even if it's what they consider demonic. Again, for me, there's also that tongue-in-cheek aspect where it's like, you know, one chooses to dwell in amongst the demons. And again, coming from the perspective of someone who doesn't really care about the ideas around hell being real or not, or demons being real or not. For me, this is all imaginative experience, to some extent or other, active imagination and astral exploration. So my point with all of this more is that for me specifically, there is a lot that comes into play when choosing dark decks in particular and finding them quite comforting. As I kind of indicated, my imagination has always ranged a little bit, almost at times out of control, in the sort of darker side of things. And while I quite enjoy that, it is really, really helpful not only to see that darkness represented in decks, especially if we're talking about representation of different types of imaginations and as well as people themselves, and having an open mind about those things, but also giving me a conduit in various ways, whether it's through children's books, adult books, art history, fiction, nonfiction, study, and tarot, and other forms of divinatory methods, etc., you know, astral projection. All of this is really, really important for helping a person contextualize their own experiences, exploring them further, and giving them commonality with other individuals. So I see all of these things in the darker decks and the more sort of quizzical, melancholic, weird and wandering kind of decks. So to close out, I wanted to give an example of some of the ways in which this actually plays out in my imagination specifically. Sort of bring it back down to the realm of real experience rather than just sort of abstract discussion of aesthetics. I tend to write a lot of poetry, especially about my imaginative experiences. So I have 2 poems. One is quite short and the other is also just generally not very long. The first I've chosen to read because it brings all of this symbolism, tarot included, back into the gallery, like art gallery, and then back out again. So it kind of also indicates the sorts of experiences that one can have with tarot can also be explored and experienced in art galleries and so on. That like all of these things have their impact on the human imagination. As we all know when we go to our favorite art galleries, regardless of what our favorite styles are. So I wrote this poem after an experience in the sort of larger historical art gallery here where I live in Cork. And I basically had this experience there, mulling over some of these things in a very particular set of circumstances that I won't go into now. And I emerged out of that, you know, imaginatively quite changed, reaffirmed, having sort of settled a few things in my mind. Because again, a lot of the way in which I brainstorm can be quite visual, as many of us who use tarot do. So this poem is called Sibyls in the Crawford. To enter fairy, you must travel time. What is the other world but a place where strange sibyls peek from starched wimples and fix you with a wry look? A place of melancholy hue and hunting scenes in snow, the lowing of cattle in sunlit pastures of the dead. Here that world still lives. Far beneath the haunted room behind the clock, the spectral processions cast stories like crumbs, like laurels, like grains of rice. I pass an amber-lobed lady with raven-painted locks and wish her many happy returns. I am a single mote of dust, a cracking spine, a flourish in a world of maudlin movement. I take my coffee with the Morning Gazette, a new exposé on Milai, such fickleness in the lauded halls of the Academy. The tailor of Gloucester draws Simkin in the margins. Charlie Chaplin sleeps in Belladonna. Deathly fruit blooms in the bosoms of essays on painted brick and Titian. The dead are hungry and poorly clad and pass away in ships to the west. I alone in the quiet halls see them see me, where witches claim asylum, and a lonely lay in the jaws of hell lilts upon a lute and harp and Gertie. I should say the idea with that poem in particular is to talk to myself, to effectively journal and record and remember the experience of seeing that all of these things that I see in daily life, in galleries or in books, also manifest in the tarot, also then have real implications for the way I use my imagination in real life. And that the historical elements of these images are all still relevant in our daily lives. A lot of these point is that the relevance that they retain are the things that I wish to focus on and feel inspired by. But I find a lot of that quite melancholy and quite sad, but in a way that I actually quite like. I enjoy melancholy. It doesn't sort of, I don't find it depressive, if I can be, so bold as to use that word. I find it, I just find that element of darkness comforting. So the last poem that I'll just read really quickly is only, a few lines long. And it was written in response to a modern painting by an artist whose name I've forgotten just now, but I'll put it on the screen and leave links below. A modern artist who borrows very heavily from the aesthetics of the Northern Renaissance and whose art just blows me away with the manner in which there's modern reference, yet also such a beautifully executed historical aesthetic. It just is my favorite kind of territory in terms of imagery. And incidentally, is also a style that I often explore in my own artistic endeavors. But at any rate, I saw this particular painting, and this poem kind of came out as a result, and it makes reference to various things, but at any rate, it's called A Passing Fool. I saw a fool upon a bridge. He capered in the cooling mist, with ladled hand and shaking fist, to raucous tunes on feathered bow, a lonely waltz he knows we know. I love to dance in iron shoes, the less fool me, and more fool you. So there you have it. Possibly a little bit weird and I don't know, maybe even not interesting. A small glimpse into some of the reasons I particularly love darker, melancholic, even creepy decks, and why in no way do I find that saddening or anything like that. I just find it really comforting. I really enjoy it, and there's something very distinctive about the aesthetic that cries out to me every time I see one. Regardless of whether I end up making a purchase, the whole point is that there's no mistaking that aesthetic, and of course loads of my decks definitely dwell in that territory. Okay, that's it for now. See you next time. Bye.